Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Well, I talked about psychic damage, and so I want to talk a little bit about radiant damage because in my exploration of 5th edition D&D, what's happening is I'm not doing it in a very systematic manner, like going from point to point to point, because plenty of people have done that. I'm talking more about my journey through this game, reading it, actually using it, playing it, finding things that confuse me a little bit or things that interest me a little bit, and then going down those rabbit holes and seeing where else that goes. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about radiant damage because there's odd types of damage in this game besides psychic damage. There is radiant damage and necrotic damage, which I want to talk about, and force damage. Things that are a little bit different than the standard. Most of the damages listed in the game are pretty obviously physical damages of one kind or another that could happen to you or I in real life. Fire, cold, piercing, bludgeoning, slashing. Hopefully none of these happen to you, anything like that. But anyhow, let's start off with a definition from the game of what radiant damage is. And we'll find this on 196. It says, radiant damage, dealt by a cleric's flame strike spell or an angel's smiting weapon, sears the flesh like fire and overloads the spirit with power. All right, cool. And so it's very evocative, gives you kind of an idea. I always think of like, the first thing I thought of was like the Raiders of the Lost Ark type stuff. So what actually causes radiant damage? There's a few different places that it comes from. Let's see, who can cause it? And I'll go through things in a little bit more detail. Hopefully this video will be nowhere near as long as a ridiculously long psychic damage video. But at the end of this, we're going to get to like how the Paladin turns really kind of weird. And the questions I had about the Paladin and psychic damage in the last video kind of led to this one where I'm scratching my head even more. So, life domain clerics and light domain clerics have some abilities which cause some radiant damage outside of spells. I think a life domain cleric at 8th level, their weapons do an extra 1d8 radiant damage, and at 14th level, another 2d8 radiant damage. So that when they hit you with their weapon, they're also like flashing with the divine light of the gods, or at least the good gods, and smiting you with this radiant damage. Okay, cool. A light domain cleric at 2nd level, his channel divinity power is like Radiance of the Dawn, and I guess he does something like 2d10 plus cleric level radiant damage to those in some kind of circle or whatever. And at 17th level, in a 60-foot radius, doesn't cause any damage, but his enemies have disadvantage on any spell that causes radiant damage or fire damage. And every once in a while in the rules, you'll see how those two kind of go together a little bit. Which I can understand for color, except sometimes they don't. Sometimes other things end up going with fire damage that gets a little weird, like, tieflings and, their resistance to it, and we'll get to that part. Maybe I'll get to that part. Anyhow, what else? There's a bunch of cleric spells which can also cause radiant damage, so we're channeling the power of the gods. One is Flame Strike, where actually it does, half the damage it does is radiant. It's like 46 fire damage and 46 radiant damage. And then for every level you're increasing the slot for, I think it's a 5th level spell, you can add another 1d6 damage, and you can choose, is it going to be radiant damage or fire damage? So, very evocative, very, the flame of God coming down to smite the enemies. All right, cool. We've got a spell called Guardian of Faith. And let's see, I think the cleric makes some kind of guardian in front of him, and when somebody enters that spot for the first moment, it does 20 radiant damage as this guardian is guarding our hero of the faith. Right? I think that one's called Guiding Bolt, and which Eloy's daughter has used in our game already. It's a pretty cool spell. It does something like 4d6 radiant damage right off the bat. Bam! Just hits you with the vengeance of the gods. I think it's a 1st level spell. Whatever it happens to be, that's not really important. There's another 3rd level spell. I think it's called Spirit Guardian, and if you are good or neutral, let's see, it does 3d8 radiant damage to your enemies. And if you're an evil cleric, well, it does 3d8 necrotic damage to your enemies. And so, it seems like maybe necrotic is the opposite of radiant damage, but not always. But that seems to be kind of the shtick, which makes sense. There's an 8th level spell called Sunburst, which does 12d6 radiant damage. Really, really damaging, really, really evocative. Okay, cool. The other thing that the rules say in terms of like clerics that causes radiant damage is the NPC priest, and it's an example they give you in the monster manual, near the end of the monster manual. And it does something like he can have his weapons do 3d6 radiant damage in addition. So more powerful than our priest, our ability from I believe our life cleric. and plus another 1d6 per level above first. I think he's using a spell slot to do that with his weapons. So pretty darn powerful. Cool. All right, here's your buddy, the NPC, good NPC cleric, unless you're an evil character. Let's see. What else causes radiant damage? Well, there's some things like holy water will cause radiant damage. The damage done by holy water is actually called radiant damage. That makes sense. It's imbued with the light of God or whatever happens to be, or the gods or the good gods. And so I think it does something like 2d6 radiant damage, and that's what it's called, or that's where the damage seems to come from. Let's see what else before we get to our paladins, because I want to save those guys for last. Angels, angelic beings. Not too many things in the monster manual, will do radiant damage. In fact, I think it's just one. It's the angelic beings, the Deva and the Planetar and the Solar, and how much radiant damage they do. They do quite a bit of radiant damage, and they do it in addition to the damage they do, the physical damage they do with their weapon. And I believe David does something an extra 4d8, Planetar does extra 5d8, Solar does an extra 6d8, and the Solar can also, like as an ability, do the Searing Blast or something for like 46 fire and 46 radiant damage. So he does something that's kind of like a Flame Strike at the end of the day. What about, there's one other thing. There's a class, or not a class, I'm sorry, a race. In the end of the Dungeon Master's Guide, when they're telling you can make different classes and different races and whatnot, well, they do you the favor of making one, or making a couple of them. And it's called the Asimar, Aasimar, and it's supposed to be, like an anti-tiefling. Instead of the offspring of some kind of infernal, a fiend and a human, well, it's the offspring of an angel and a human. And I don't want to go into like how or why that might have happened. They don't cause any radiant damage, but they're resistant to it. The angelic beings, the Solar, the Planetar, Deva, they're all resistant to radiant damage. So are these. And it says, well, gosh, just because radiant damage is less common than something like fire damage, because the tieflings are resistant to fire damage, which is kind of one of these places where the radiant, fire and radiant kind of diverge for a second. We'll say they also have, I think, resistance to necrotic damage, because necrotic is bad or evil or whatever happens to be. So, okay, cool. That makes sense. It's a little bit odd at the very end, but, okay, that makes sense. Let's go back to, there's a bunch of magic items that cause it, and they all make, quite a bit of sense. The Helm of Brilliance does something like undead within 30 feet take 1d6 radiant damage. If the helm takes fire damage and you roll a 1 on a d20, the next thing you know, everybody within 60 feet takes radiant damage equal to the number of gems. The Holy Avenger sword, very classic, iconic thing that can only use a cleric, or a paladin rather. If you're a fiend or an undead, you take an extra 2d10 radiant damage every time that the paladin uses this weapon on you. The Mace of Disruption. If fiend or undead, take an extra 2d6 damage. Let's see, the Sunblade, which is a freaking lightsaber. It's this sword handle you find, and it'll make this blade of light, and what it causes is radiant damage. It's like, I think undead it does all radiant damage, and an undead will take another 1d8 radiant damage. The Talisman of Pure Good, which is the opposite of the Talisman of Pure Evil. Let's see, neutral creatures take 66 radiant damage from touching this thing, It's like the Ark of the Covenant sort of stuff. And if you're an evil creature, if you're a Nazi, you take 8d6 radiant damage when touching it. And then, even better, the Book of Exalted Deeds, the holiest of holy books. Any evil creature that tries to read it takes 24d6 radiant damage. This ignores any kind of immunity. This ignores any kind of resistance, and there's no way, no save, nothing. So good book. Well, that'll kill you if you're a bad guy. Anyhow, so that's what causes it in terms of magic items. But let's get to the paladin, because the paladin gets a little bit weird. We already talked about the idea that the cleric will have, he can make some of his weapons do that. But let's see what else here. Let's see. Paladin, second level paladin, has a power called Divine Smite. We're going to get back to this. And he can expend a spell slot to deal an extra 2d8 radiant damage with his melee attacks. And on a first level spell slot. And then 1d8 for each spell slot above that to a max of 5d8. And if anything is a fiend, well, they take another 1d8 damage on top of that. An 11th level Paladin has something called Improved Divine Smite, where all of his melee attacks already do another 1d8 radiant damage. These things are fairly evocative. These things make sense. It's like the divine, energy of his god, his good god that the Paladin is channeling. It's the kind of thing he's supposed to be doing. So it's an interesting way of representing that. A Paladin, 20th level Paladin of the Oath of Devotion, he has this Holy Nimbus action. It's exactly the same, or just about exactly the same as that Oathbreaker Paladin I talked about in the psychic damage section, where the enemies within this aura take something like 10 radiant damage at the start of every turn. I'm not sure, looking back on this, why the Oathbreaker Paladin didn't cause necrotic damage rather than psychic damage on the start of every turn. That would make a lot more sense. Way back when, why are you using psychic damage for that when you could use necrotic damage? Isn't that a lot more evocative of what they do? But I'll probably examine necrotic damage tomorrow and go into detail. And once again, I went through all 3 books. I found every single example that was in there of all the, radiant damage. Radiant damage in this case. All right, we talked about Holy Water. Paladin spell at 3rd level is Blinding Smite, does 3d8 radiant damage, and the bright light also blinds the creature. Spell called Branding Smite does, I think it's, let's see, what level is this thing? It's 2d6 radiant damage, 1d6 per slot above 2nd. So it's one of those spells you can keep on increasing or cast at a higher level, so it's a 2nd level spell. They have a spell called Crusader's Mantle, 3rd level, at a 30-foot radius. You and your allies do 1d4 radiant damage with every hit. And it might be concentration or a certain amount of time. Okay. There's another spell called Divine Favor. It's kind of like Crusader's Mantle Light, where your weapon damage is doing an extra 1d4 radiant damage. And I think that's concentration up to a minute. Let's see, that's a cleric spell. Let's see. And all this stuff. Just want to make sure I don't miss anything before I start really kind of looking at this. Okay, so the Paladin has these other spells that do, he and his friends can do extra amounts of radiant damage for a certain period of time, rather than expending a spell slot and, doing a more massive amount of radiant damage. I think it's got a little bit weird here. Alrighty. Here's where the cleric gets really strange. And then we'll quit, the Paladin rather, and then we'll stop picking on this. And this is one of those examples too where I just wonder, like, it seemed like there was a little bit of sloppy design, or they, well, let's take a look. That may not be too. So we have once again, we have our Divine Favor spell, 1st level spell. And it's a concentration up to a minute. And so what happens is our Paladin does an extra 1d4 radiant damage for up to a minute with every melee attack. Okay, cool. So he has to concentrate on it. So it's more powerful than the single, your next attack does this. Because most of these spells and spell slots, it's like your next, I think it's your next attack or your next hit, whatever happens to be, This one gives you a little bit more time, and you're only doing a little bit here. So we'll go to our Divine Smite power. Okay, so it's a 1st level, it's not really a spell, kind of is, because you're using a spell slot. It does 2d8 damage at 1st level, 3d8 at 2nd level, 4d8 at 3rd level, 5d8 at 4th level. There's no real 5th level because you max out there. And if you're a fiend, it does another extra 1d8. Okay, that's pretty powerful. Then we have another thing that does radiant damage, okay? Because these are both radiant damage. Here's our Branding Smite. We talked about this. When did I talk about this? It doesn't matter. There's our Branding Smite. I talked about today, Branding Smite. Well, this thing, what it does is for 1 minute, it causes the creature to also become visible. Or they can't become invisible if they're not visible. It kind of surrounds them with this kind of fairy fire sort of light, that sort of thing. So it's 2nd level spell. So it does 2d6, plus they're visible. But if you're going to use your Divine Smite power, well, you do 3d8. So I guess this creature being visible for up to a minute, or not be able to turn invisible, or to kind of, because it doesn't give anybody any kind of advantage to have these things glowing, by the way. I'm not really sure what the deal is with that. So you're doing 2d6 versus 3d8. I'm not sure why you would expend a spell slot in that way, cast that spell, rather than just use your Divine Smite power. But anyhow, let's go on. Let's go to our Blinding Smite. This is our, let's see, it's a 3rd level spell. It does 3d8, and on an unsuccessful save, it blinds the creature for a certain amount of time. And if you use your Divine Smite power, well, you'd be doing 4d8 radiant damage. So I guess for an extra, for a d8, you're having the chance to maybe blind this creature for a little bit. Okay. Now let's go back to our psychic damage. The thing that started confusing me yesterday about this Paladin, or a couple days ago, when I said, "Gosh, it really seems like they should do radiant damage rather than psychic damage when they're using one of these spells and they're adding this damage to their weapon." So we've got our Wrathful Smite, first level spell. You do 1d6 psychic damage, and if they fail a save, they're afraid of you. But I can use my Divine Smite power and use a spell slot, first level spell slot, and do 2d8 radiant damage. How badly do you really want this creature to be afraid of you? You know, that you're going to trade 2d8 damage for 1d6 damage. It's psychic damage. I'm not sure why it wouldn't be radiant damage instead of psychic damage, except maybe it's because it's making the creature afraid of you? Maybe, kinda, sorta. I'm not really sure. Okay, and here's our other Staggering Smite, which is listed as psychic damage rather than radiant damage. And it does 4d6 psychic damage. It's a 4th level spell. And if they fail their save, then they have a disadvantage on their attacks and saves and all that kind of stuff. And I think they can't take a reaction for the rest of their turn. So it's, for the rest of their part of the round. So this 46 psychic damage instead of 5d8 radiant damage, which you could use expending the same kind of spell. Is their disadvantage worth that much? And why is it psychic damage because you're confusing them? I'm not really sure. And I'm not really sure why the Paladin should have this power in the first place to do psychic damage as opposed to radiant damage. It gets a little weird. Like, why would that happen? Well, the Paladin gets even weirder. All right, he can do something called a Banishing Smite. Everything's a smite with a Paladin. They smite their enemies. So this is a 5th level spell. You're banishing your enemy back to hell. But your weapon does a bunch of force damage. It does 6d10 force damage. If we go back to our Divine Smite, a Paladin power, which you can just, expend a spell slot for, it tops out at 4th level at 5d8. There is no 5th level version of Divine Smite. I'm not really sure why in the world you wouldn't just have the damage of our Banishing Smite be radiant damage. If you want 6d10 radiant damage, 68, whatever it happens to be. I'm not sure why they felt compelled to make it force damage instead of radiant damage. It just doesn't fit. Doesn't seem to make sense. And if you think of all the other things that are force damage, magic missiles and those sort of things, it just doesn't kind of like, I don't know, doesn't seem to fit. It's very kind of odd. Like, why wouldn't they make that just a spell that does radiant damage, and here it fills in the extra 5th level slot? I can see kind of maybe the psychic damage great thing, but it doesn't seem like the Paladin should be able to do that. Or it should be radiant. Who knows? Anyhow, let's see. They've got some other spells. They've got Thunderous Smite. It's a 1st level spell. It does 2d6 thunder damage, and it pushes you back 10 feet. My wizard in a last game has a spell like that. I forget what it's called, Thunderous something. And I used it the other day, and it was really cool. I used it in a bar. I broke a bunch of glasses. I pushed a bunch of guys that were about to really kind of mob me. It was very, very useful. It was very, very wizardy. I did this thunderous acoustic damage to him. On a flavor basis, it seems very evocative to have the instrument of the gods do something and hit somebody, and the thunder crackles and all that kind of stuff, and there's a boom. The gods are angry. But it just seems to me like a kind of like a Me Too thing. Like, yeah, me too. I should be able to, maybe I could do like a different kind of damage. This one does not scale up as far as I know. But his enemies are pushed away from him. So it almost seems like, the Paladin spell list is small. And it almost really seems like they were just kind of wondering, like, well, what else do we put in here? I'm not really sure, Fred. What do you think? Let's give him that version of the wizard spell. And yeah, okay, great. But it doesn't seem to fit the flavor, if you will. It was a little odd. Let's see. There is fire. You can do it's like Flaming Smite or whatever the heck it is. Searing Smite, another 1st level spell. It does 1d6 damage, and it scales up, so you can do anywhere from 1d6 to 5d6 fire damage. Or you could use your Divine Smite, doing radiant damage, and do 2d8 instead of 1d6. Or 3d8 instead of 2d6. The only advantage this thing gives you is you can possibly light them on fire, and if they fail some kind of, I think it's a Constitution save, then they're on fire and taking 1d6 per round until but they get to make a save every round. They're able to put themselves out finally, and they stop taking that damage. It really seems odd. Seems odd. Like why you'd want to do that. Once again, it just kind of looks like you've got these three spells: Searing Smite, Thunder Smite, Wrathful Smite, doing fire, thunder, and psychic damage, all first level spells, and it really just seems like they were like near the end of getting the book ready, and said, screw it, just let's put. I guess have them do this kind of damage. Now the Paladin does have a spell called I think it might be second level spell, whatever the heck it is. Yeah, I think it's second level. It's called like Magic Weapon, and so he can make a weapon into a magic weapon. Very, very useful. It'd be neat to be able to hit something that can only be hit by a magic weapon. Okay, cool. But then they have this spell that's one level higher, third level, and it's called Elemental Weapon. And so our Elemental Weapon does another 1d4 damage cast at third level, 2d4 cast at fourth, and 3d4 cast at fifth level. Now, so it does an extra 1d4 cast at third level, as opposed to 4d8 radiant damage cast at third level, or 2d4 at fourth level instead of 5d8 radiant damage. Now, it does make it a magic weapon. It does give you something like a +1, +2, +3, I think, as it goes on. So it'll be a plus weapon cast at third level, a +2 at fourth, and a +3. And let's see, what kind of elementals can you have here? I was looking at what Eloy was writing. Cold, fire, lightning, or thunder. Those are your choices of the kind of damage it does. And, Eloy kind of already put down in his comment, because he's watching this video, that it seems like maybe it's giving them the chance to bypass certain kinds of resistances or take advantage of certain kind of vulnerabilities. And I believe that's what they're doing here, is you're going to do far less damage. You're not going to do the psychic, 48 psychic damage. You're going to do 1d4, but maybe something really is, very vulnerable to cold damage or thunder damage or something like that. Although I'm not really sure at that point why you wouldn't just use a first level spell and cast Thunder Smite for 2d6 thunder damage. Not sure why you would cast a third level spell and do 1d4 thunder damage at that point. But it just seems like they were kind of mailing it in. Anyhow, what else? What else is there? What are the other kinds? Yeah, cold, fire, lightning, thunder. Lightning, so maybe it gives you that one chance to do electrical damage. Cold is your one chance to do cold damage. But the fire damage here, let's see, you're going to do 1d4 damage at third level doing that. Or you could cast Searing Smite at third level and do 3d6 fire damage and light them on fire. Now, of course, that's not a magic weapon, so maybe it's because you need a magic weapon. So there's parts in here where the Paladin gets really weird, where, to be honest with you, it seems like, as Eloy said, it seems like they were having trouble coming up with things for him to do or be able to do, and society, well, let's see if maybe he has this, what's the word I'm looking for? This armory of different weapons that attack, can tag the different types of resistances and get past them. And so he can use cold damage and fire damage. And it just seems a little, it's a stretch. On an aesthetic level, it doesn't work for me. It jars me. You may love it. I just think overall it gets weird. Going way back, I love the idea of radiant damage. I love the idea of making that different. That's very evocative, very, very cool. It's very cool the way they do it for clerics. It's very cool the magic items that use radiant damage. It's very cool the monsters that have vulnerabilities to it, like the vampire and the revenant, which they simply cannot regenerate. If they get hit by that stuff, and they actually take quite a bit of damage. That sort of thing. I like the kind of creatures that can cause it. It makes sense. The angelic beings and all that kind of stuff. It just starts to seem a little odd when it comes to the Paladin. That's it. Take it easy, kids. And once again, yes, this video was way too flippin' long. Have a good one.